Thank you all so much for coming here. Thank you so much again to the organizers, program chairs, local chair Adam, everybody else who's making this such an awesome community to return to. And we're with this tutorial. So my name is Lily Shu. We have Emily Aiken here in the front row, who I'll be switching off with. Mikhail Gar, who is currently present, but has to teach his master's students right now. He'll be here tomorrow during the second part of the tutorial session, which is happening at 10:30 tomorrow morning. And then there's Paul Wiles, who unfortunately can't make it in person because he has a lot of restrictions on his postdoc. They want him in person at Berkeley to do important research. But he was really instrumental in like the ideation and the content of what we're presenting today. So that is our tutorial piece. And then tomorrow, Sarah Lenardi will be leading a discussion session on some infrastructure questions. So we'll try to keep it. We have a lot packed into these 3 hours. So what we'll be talking about today for this 2 hours is trying to look at this question of energy social impact and what that means, and really go behind the scenes. So this is trying to look at how we can be researchers and then really do this whole bridging research practice that we talk so much about within Fresh here for EAAMO'23. We'll concretize this pipeline with 2 case studies today. So Emily and I will each present case studies from our own experience working on these kinds of work, and then Nikki Ogard will present a 3rd case study tomorrow. But then we'll have a 40-minute session at the end of today's slot that will be like an interactive session where we have a number of fun topics for you all to do a little interactive project on trying to brainstorm relevant stakeholders and different possibilities for actually bridging research to impact and working on trying to identify important problems and move all the way to evaluation and implementation. Okay. So things that this tutorial is trying to be really a practical guide to starting and also finishing a project in AI for social impact or social impact more broadly. And I think the origins of this tutorial is, I think all of us among the tutorial organizers have had a lot of people come up to us saying, hey, I'm really interested in doing applied work, but I just don't know how to start. I don't know how to pick a project. I don't know who to talk to. I don't know how to identify what's going on, but I have these kind of like strong computational tools that I know, and I just want to do something that's useful, but how do I find that? So I feel like there's this huge gap in just the initial step of, practically, we see these papers come out, but then they talk about, oh, here's the problem, and here's how we solve it, and now we're going to go into math. But all the behind the scenes conversations about how does that partnership get built, how did you identify what you work on in the first place is always missing in those conversations. We'll talk about the pros and cons to doing this kind of work so that if this becomes an endeavor that you want to take on, you're at least aware of kind of some of the failure processes that you might be embarking on. And things that this tutorial is not. So this is not obviously a comprehensive overview. 2 hours is not enough time to cover everything. We won't be defining what social impact is. So kind of the scope of what social impact means is too big a conversation today. This will not be a research talk, so we won't be focused on like the math or the methods, but more the kind of why do we choose this method for the project. And also, this is not just AI for social impact, it's computational tools more broadly, or you could call it algorithms, mechanisms, and optimization. Okay, so the research to practice pipeline that we really want to hammer down today are these 4 core components. And we really hope that throughout the 3 case studies that we're presenting across wildlife conservation and humanitarian aid targeting and resident crowdsourcing in New York City are all so different, both in methods and problems that we're working on, but structurally and in terms of like working through this process, they really kind of follow this consistent structure. And it's really important that we don't focus on any one particular aspect of this pipeline. So oftentimes what we actually see published in research papers is a solution design component. So we only really get a window into that second box when we're reading technical papers. But then there's everything else that's going on. Like how do they, even pick this project to work on? How do they build these partnerships? And then how do they collect the data? How do they get this working in practice? And then actually understand whether or not this method is something that should be continued is all neglected in that discussion. So we'll do a dive into all of these things. And one of the other things we want to highlight that we think is really critical to effectively bridging research and practice and achieving impact is having a strong support network, which is what this conference is really kind of about with the MD for SG community throughout the rest of the calendar year, tries to achieve as well. So we're really excited that you all are here to help the community. Okay, so I'll begin by going in on the first two sections of this, and then Emily will dive into implementation and evaluation. So first, trying to scope out a project. So I really emphasize that if you want to be working on some kind of real world project, you can't just lightly dabble. You can't just find an interesting, relevant, technically important question right away. You have to be fully immersed in that. And my recommendation for doing so is figure out something that really excites you and treat it as a hobby. So whether that's education or environment or development, care, or criminal justice, really just try to be immersed in what is happening.
You switch to this mic so you can mention.
Okay.
Even though it's because people can't hear you.
Cool.
Yeah, it's okay. You can keep talking.
So really being immersed in everything that is happening in that space. So that could be following the news, signing up for newspapers, listening to podcasts, or just chatting with as many people as you can who are actually domain experts in that problem. And also actually finding them at their spaces. So going to interdisciplinary conferences that are not, they perhaps pick one conference out of the year, whatever is happening locally, or a local meetup on whatever that topic area is that you're choosing. So obviously this is more fun if it's a topic that you're actually passionate about and if it's a community that you're really excited about. So again, really trying to figure out one thing that you're more interested in. And it's also hard to kind of go into these settings as an academic who doesn't have prior experience there. So if you have friends who studied sociology or political science or social work and they're currently working on that, it's much easier to kind of go through one person you already know or have perhaps met at some event. So those are just kind of the seed possibilities for how to get started. And importantly, actually making that community so it's a consistent kind of iterative feedback process and learning process. And MD4SG offers a number of working groups to try to foster those kinds of environments. So we have 6 currently active working groups across inequality, diversification, development, African Islam policy, and environment, which try to create these recurring bi-weekly spaces where you can talk with the interdisciplinary community, understand what the state-of-the-art problems are from a domain perspective, and start to learn the vocabulary of that domain. Okay. So when it comes to now you figure out your domain and you want to identify a problem, first ask the question, who is impacted by this challenge, and understand what their needs are. So if there's some goal that they already have or a project that they're already taking on, trying to help them with that would be a really easy way to get started. And really importantly, there's so many urgent problems out there that aren't highlighted in the kind of news that reaches a broader audience. And oftentimes that comes from really, you can understand what those kind of frontline problems are by talking with the frontline workers, the local community members, and oftentimes those aren't on major news sources because by the time that they reach kind of national or international news, a lot more people are already aware of what's going on than if you instead read local news sources or go to those smaller community members or town meetings, for example, then you can be much more exposed to kind of problems that are more accessible to you. And that's takes us to our next point, which is really trying to get at an intersection of an important problem to work on. It has to be simultaneously important and impacting a broader community, but also something that you can actually have leverage to make a difference in. And then in the course of thinking through what problems to work on, we really encourage you to consider all possible impacted stakeholders. So oftentimes those marginalized and underrepresented perspectives are those voices that are heard least in these processes and in these surveys. Okay. So then after you've identified a problem and you've kind of like picked a domain that you're interested in, you want to actually get data and find a way to implement this. And this requires strong partnerships. And forming a good partnership really requires relationship building. And the first step here is effective communication. So by being immersed in this problem, then you can understand kind of what their jargon is, how they think about things. And I am a huge advocate of being really accommodating with time zones, for example. So I work on conservation problems, and oftentimes I'm looking at folks in Cambodia or Uganda, and I take meetings at 5:30 in the morning if necessary, or in the evening, because these are just the times that are available to them. Some folks are really intentional about kind of having a prototype of possible solution before they start trying to seek out partnerships. But one challenge with that is that if you have a prototype, you've already kind of decided how you're going to build that solution, and that might not end up being the most effective way of going about it. So you're kind of imposing a solution at that stage. So that's something to consider. And a lot of these conversations won't lead to anything substantive, but it's all part of that process. I recommend navigating this trade-off of idealism in finding a perfect topic. We're trying to understand like what is the most important problem versus availability, because it's often much harder to find a partner who is kind of like ready and excited to work with you. So if you have something that's kind of like important, but not necessarily the most important problem, I recommend going for that route instead of just searching through many other things. And through these partnerships, one important consideration is that the partners, even if they don't have any formal education or they don't have advanced degrees, they have so much frontline expertise that really exceeds what we know. It's just a whole different form of expertise. So just because they're not affiliated with a particular institution or don't have a PhD, does not mean that they don't deserve kind of the maximum possible respect. And as part of this, being really sensitive to what their needs are. So they are constantly dealing with crises, and talking with researchers is really low on their list of priorities. And there's some communities I work with where if you say that you're a researcher, that's kind of like the worst possible thing to say to them, because they've just been burned so many times by people coming in, picking their data, and just not offering anything useful in advance. Okay. And then thinking, now that you kind of figured out your problem and you want to start designing a solution, things to consider are evaluating what infrastructure currently exists. So can you build upon that existing infrastructure to kind of minimize friction later on when it comes to implementation and evaluation? Understand what constraints they have. And one really valuable thing of understanding those constraints is in the research world, especially from a theoretical perspective, there's an infinite number of possible research questions that we can work on. But if we try to figure out, okay, what are their constraints? What are their challenges? Is it, computational efficiency? Is it resource allocation? Is it data analysis? This is a really valuable filtering process for us to determine like what the next priority should be for us as computational. And then anything you can do to integrate domain expertise into solution design, whether that's problem structure or whatnot, is helpful, and all that requires that domain integration and slow iterative process. Okay. So we've identified the problem. So here, there's this girl who's kind of learning how to swim, and we're helping her swim. So obviously this girl benefits, but it can be really easy to find a problem and be really excited about, okay, I'm going to design a solution, and then be myopic as to what the rest of that picture is. So here's, another poor child who is clearly not receiving equal benefit from this swim lesson. So we need to also think about, are there possibly people who are harmed by the design of our solution? And this really requires, at the beginning, recognizing those that whole array of stakeholders are. And then how are the benefits distributed, especially compared to what this was beforehand. So really this is this process of talking with stakeholders, brainstorming through ideas, and you can start off simple and then slowly grow more complex, as we'll discuss. So oftentimes those initial problems might not be research problems, they might be more engineering problems, so they might be more initial exploratory problems. But over time, as you get more immersed, as you build up trust with those partners, then you're more likely to actually have something more fruitful. And a benefit of this is this could possibly result in multiple papers if you keep up the iterative process. Okay, so now you've picked out your project, you scoped out a solution, then you have the whole 6 months to however number of years of the research component, and then you can get to implementation.
All right, can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So yeah, I'm gonna basically pick up exactly where we left off. I'm Emily, I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, just finishing up my PhD. I do work on AI development economics, which we'll hear about a bit in the case studies. But like Lily said, I'm gonna kind of finish up here on the sort of high level pipeline of how these AI for social impact projects are implemented. And again, we're kind of assuming this, like, in this gap here, you've done what you all do best, which is come up with really innovative AI-based solutions and come up with something very, very clever to address a real social impact challenge. How do you actually go about implementing that in the real world? I wanted to highlight a couple of things that often come up in my experience in AI for social impact projects, maybe come up somewhat less in just general AI projects. And the first is that, of course, these systems rely really, really heavily on data. Of course, data probably will come up again and again as you go through this pipeline. And so again, it's not exactly a linear pipeline, but I just want to highlight that meeting the data needs of your project in the AI for social impact space is super important. So it's worth considering, does the data you need already exist, or do you need to go out and collect data? That would be the logistics and expense associated with collecting data. And also, at least in my work, it comes up a lot with the issue of data quality and up-to-dateness. And so considering as you develop an AI for social impact solution, how often data would need to be recollected to keep it up to date. And then lastly, of course, is a bucket of questions around where data is stored, who it belongs to, is this data publicly available, is it privately collected, and if so, what are the implications for data sharing agreements, the legal implications, as well as sort of the incentive implications for developing data sharing arrangements with people, with like data holders. And again, we'll talk about that in the case studies. Of course, there's also a bit of concerns there around data privacy, data security, and so on. And at least in my view, in AI for social impact type of applications, these concerns are even more important than in just like regular AI projects. One other concern that will come up probably more in AI for social good projects than just regular AI projects is that of computational infrastructure. So first, just on like computing hardware is the important question of, do you have the capacity to carry out the sort of AI that you want to do in your solution? And where does that hardware live? Does it need to, the computing need to happen on-prem? Can it happen off-prem or in the cloud? And then of course, it's also the human infrastructure aspect. So the question of how much of the project are you able to implement versus how much technical capacity do your partners need to have? These are probably all good questions to talk about, before and as you deploy projects with partners. And to that point, as you deploy projects, working with partners iteratively becomes increasingly important. So it becomes, I think, in my experience, and probably Lily would agree, increasingly important to have a lot of humility and really listen to partners and be willing to edit and revise and change the system based on their feedback. There's one thing I can say based on my experience, and give you one lesson to take away from this tutorial. It's that if you develop a solution and want to deploy it, I think piloting at a small scale multiple times ideally is very, very important, because probably the first time you try deploying it, a lot of things won't work. Might be things with the AI, might be like really simple interface things. And so piloting, starting small and collecting good quantitative as well as qualitative data in your pilot is really helpful for catching those types of issues early on. And again, just to emphasize, in the deployment stage and then throughout the pipeline, really thorough and good listening and good communication with partners is really critical. All right, so the final stage of the pipeline now, assuming you've implemented the project, maybe you've done like a medium-sized pilot study and it's been a great success. How do you go about thinking about how to evaluate the success and also continue to maintain that solution with your partners into the future? Starting with evaluation, I'm part economist, and so I think a lot about how to evaluate the impact of interventions. So how do you know you've deployed your solution? How do you know if it works? How do you know if you actually had the impact in the so-called social impact? I think a lot of us in AI or machine learning will start by thinking about like sort of standard machine learning accuracy metrics. Like, did you build a predictive system or an algorithmic system that was somewhat accurate? So you think about like precision, recall, R-squared, whatever, pick your favorite accuracy metric. But beyond that, when we think about AI for social impact, is the question of like, how well did whatever partner take decisions informed by your AI system? I've been with my collaborators ready to call this like intervention accuracy, the question of how accurate was the actual intervention informed by your system, not just how accurate were your predictions. And then of course, most importantly, how accurate were the AI informed decisions relative to whatever would have been done in the status quo without your AI system? How much did you improve the accuracy of decisions by implementing this new AI-infused approach? I think that's all kind of just like in the accuracy bucket. The second bucket, of course, is the actual question of impact. So presumably your AI system is helping guide some intervention, you know, whatever it is that the policymakers and the partners are doing to try to improve welfare of some group. And so, of course, the question of how much does the intervention actually improve welfare, we somehow track those impacts. And then also, did adding AI to the system cause more welfare improvement than just the existing status quo intervention? And then lastly, I think a really important type of evaluation to think about conducting is this issue of algorithmic externalities. Are there ways that your algorithm or your AI-infused system is behaving that causes positive or negative externalities that maybe you didn't anticipate? Or how can we try to track and evaluate these unintended consequences? In terms of evaluation methods, I think there's, again, kind of different buckets of evaluation methods that more or less map on to those different evaluation metrics. The first, of course, is like a standard ML evaluation approach. You have to kind of train test set, maybe you like train on older data and look at how it performs into the future and measure basically different forms of accuracy. Beyond that, in terms of evaluating impacts, there's, I think, increasing work on doing impact evaluation of these types of AI-infused solutions. The sort of gold standard, at least in economics in my field, for impact evaluation is randomized controlled trials. But as we roll out these AI-infused systems, there's also a lot of scope for quasi-experimental approaches to impact evaluation. So like differences models, we roll out these approaches in different places. And then typically, I think when you're working with partners often have a lot of like monitoring and evaluation that they're already doing, and they're already collecting key performance metrics that mean a lot to them. So keeping track of that and how AI-infused solutions help with those is important. And then lastly, on this point of looking for unintended consequences, I think it's really worth considering trying to do some surveys or at least some qualitative interviews with people who are impacted by the algorithmic system to understand how they're interacting with it and if it's being interacted with in the way that you intended for it to be in the first place. Moving on to talk about follow-up projects and maintenance. I think sort of how, after you deploy a system, how projects continue after that is like a lot of heterogeneity in that. But there's a few different ways you might think about follow-ups going. The first is, of course, this question of continuation. Like, you deployed an AI tool, you sort of handed it to the partners. Can they continue to use your tool without you? And what does that handoff look like? We'll talk about that. I'll talk about that again in my case study. But I think it's worth, thinking to yourself about how much time and interest you have or your group has in continuing to maintain that tool and continuing to be involved with the project. Beyond just continuing with a single partner, it's a question of replicability. Like, can other researchers take your code and go and use this tool or do this project elsewhere? At least in my experience, my research code on one project does not look like code that other people can use very well, and so there's often a lot of labor that goes into trying to put together code that other people can use and reuse. And also there's questions of how portable a solution is from one place to another. And then lastly, I think the sort of maybe gold standard that some of us at least are searching for is this question of deployment. Like, can we take our tool and turn it into an off-the-shelf tool that non-academics, maybe non-technical people can use and reuse in different contexts? And of course, there's like really different levels of investment required in these different buckets. And it's not always the case that researchers will have the capacity to do all of these things. But it's something worth thinking about, at least in my experience, in advance of what's sort of a continuation plan for a project. All right, I'm just gonna take a few more minutes to wrap up before we move into the case studies. I think one thing Lily and I wanted to talk about in the context of this AI for social impact research is how we trade off between methodological advances and like research contributions and then social impact. There probably exists this Pareto curve, you know, where you're trying to trade off these two things. And typically, when you're just getting into the field, at least for me when I was like a first PhD student, I kind of started down here, definitely not on the frontier, where I wasn't making as much social impact as I wanted to, and I also wasn't like doing any mind-blowing research that was really contributing to a lot of methodological advances. But as you continue to engage with partners, as you really dig into a particular area, and as you learn more and more about the methods that make sense in that area, you're likely to move out towards the frontier and be able to do cooler and cooler research across both of these dimensions. And then, of course, at least for those of us who are researchers and academics and are looking to publish papers and perhaps get academic jobs, you do at some point need to be, you know, out in the space, at least making some contributions to the research field as well as social impact, ideally at the same time. All right, I think with that, I'm going to hand it back to Lily, and we're going to jump into a couple of case studies of our own work in terms of how we've seen this research to practice pipeline play out in two different settings. Again, we'll have a third one of those tomorrow, and then we'll move to the group project for the last like 40 minutes.
Even if there's anyone in the audience who's seen my talk, we talked about this work before. Hopefully, this brings a lot more behind the scenes work that normally I don't get to talk about in regular research conference talks. So I work on environmental conservation, specifically thinking about how to protect animals from poaching in protected areas around the world. So this is Murchison Falls National Park, which is the largest protected area in Uganda and one that I had the pleasure of working with throughout my PhD. And this is an article that appeared in The Guardian over the summer of all the snares, which are traps placed out by poachers to catch elephants and tigers and leopards and deer and other animals. So this mountain of snares is 12 months of traps removed from Murchison Falls. So a single calendar year is about 12 tons of snares. And with every single circular wire roll that you see here is one animal trap. So there's just imagine how many animal lives could have been compromised if you think about it. And Murchison Falls has an extreme number of snares, about 4 snares for every square kilometer in the park. And this park is only 5,000 square kilometers large. So about 20,000 snares in the park. They only have 250 rangers to patrol the whole space. So the important question of resource allocation to try to determine where the rangers should go, that poachers are frequently targeting catch them. And my research focuses on actually building machine learning and AI decision-making tools that help rangers patrol by predicting future hotspots and sending them on optimal routes throughout the park. But the backstory of how this project came about, which is not really something you think about using AI for, like, oh yeah, you know, rangers in a protected area with like, no satellites and no technology. Why AI or game theory and these methods would be useful. So the origins of this story came prior to my time on this project. So my advisor, Lily has been working on security games for a long time, specifically partnering with the US Coast Guard and other organizations to help plan randomized patrol routes so that like terrorists or other folks attacking the ports would not be able to understand where the Coast Guard was. And this is treated as Stackelberg security games, which are a type of leader-follower model and game theory that enables this kind of strategic planning. And then my advisor was listening to just kind of like the local kind of national news in India, and there's this movie star talking about how tigers in India are going extinct. And my advisor, Millen, was like, oh, that's really interesting. And I want to help save the tigers. And I've been doing this work on, coastal protection. Maybe I can do this work on forest protection as well. So he started showing up to a bunch of conservation workshops and events and just talking with people saying, hey, do you have any data? This is the kind of work that I've been doing before. And it took a lot of conversations for he, going to all these conservation events in India and in the US before he finally found these partners at WWF Malaysia who are interested in working with him. So that's kind of how this project got started, really just going to these events, having a bunch of these conversations and saying, hey, I did, one work on this method in a totally different area. Maybe we can use it to help save the tigers too. But then I joined the group in 2018, and I had the pleasure of really helping to deepen and strengthen these relationships. So in the first year of my PhD, I went on a field visit to Sri Pak Wildlife Sanctuary in Cambodia. So this is me talking with the ranger manager in Sri Pak and my advisor, Millen Tanmay, these photos as well. And in this week-long field visit, we went on patrols with the rangers. We were sleeping in a hammock at their patrol post, really seeing like what their lives were like, what resources they had, and the answer is not very much at all. So in Sri Pak, for example, the rangers will go off. It's a very, very large park, and the rangers will go on patrols for 4 days at a time. And then I remember when I was like looking at the data, trying to figure out where they were going, their GPS coordinates were tracking their locations every 30 minutes. And I said, oh, if you're on motorbikes and you go 30 minutes in one direction, there's kind of a big gap, and I don't know exactly where you went. It would be really useful if I could have better interpolation of your route. Can you just lower the settings? So instead of tracking every 30 minutes, you track every 2 minutes or 5 minutes. So they said, oh no, well, we can't do that because we don't have our phone batteries would die in the process. I said, oh, well, can you just bring, spare battery packs with you that cost $10? You can just easily get this phone packs. So they said, sorry, we can't afford to buy phone packs. So this is just kind of like the resource constraints that they have. They don't even have, the money for boots for the rangers or for spare battery packs to charge up their phone for a 4-day patrol. So those kinds of conversations and intuitions about what their day-to-day look like and how the decision-making happens on the ground was really made possible through this process. But even outside of being on the ground, in Cambodia and then Belize and then Uganda throughout most of my PhD, there's kind of endless meetings that I'm in with these partners and just kind of talk through examples of what that data looks like. So when I was first doing this work in year 1 of my PhD, trying to build machine learning models in Sri Pak for their coaching works. I was meeting with them every 2 weeks to try to just iterate through, okay, these are the results I'm getting, these are the features I'm putting in, these are the kind of recommendations I give to you, does this make sense at all? And then they would give me feedback, and I go back and I make those changes and then be ready for that next discussion. So then that was this little bit of trying to formulate the problem and figure out how we would actually do this implementation in advance of my visit. So then we moved to kind of more weekly sessions. And then when we actually had the implementation stage and I was making these recommendations and we implemented a series of 5-month field tests on the ground, we had monthly meetings just to check in on the data that we had gotten from last time, analyzing where they actually were finding snares and where they weren't, but also assessing the feasibility. So did I give them recommendations to patrol an area that they couldn't access or didn't go to for whatever reason? And then using that to learn more about their on-the-ground operations. And then when you're kind of in the maintenance stage of, okay, now we have a system that's in place and it's being used, still having regular meetings to make sure that we are keeping up that communication. And this is every stage of my PhD from 2018 until now has been along one of these. So I feel like I have no fewer than 1 meeting a month with our folks at WWF, along with other partners that we built in the process. But there's other times we have perhaps a special event where there's maybe fundraising or there's something urgent happening where there's wildfires in a park, and then at that time we could be meeting up to 3 times a week, for example. So it's really a lot of behind the scenes conversations. But then aside from kind of building up that partnership and building up those relationships, from the algorithmic perspective, so I mentioned that initially I was just building machine learning models trying to predict poaching hotspots, and doing that in Chicago Wildlife Sanctuary, Cambodia. But then there's another park that I started talking to through WWF, Royal State Park in Malaysia, and they were really interested in having more strategic control planning. So I was interacting with them, and they said, we're really excited about what you've done in Cambodia. Can you make those predictions for our park as well? And I said, I'd be happy to work with you. So they sent me their data, and this is what I saw, which is 3 months of patrols, fewer than 1,000 observations, more than half the park had never been patrolled at all, realizing that there's just no way to do machine learning here. So then I was thinking, okay, well, I know what to do here. There's a whole field called active learning, where I can, go to the areas where the model has the most uncertainty, and then we can use that to improve our model in the first place. And then in my second year of my PhD, I presented this idea of information gathering patrols, like an active learning project, at a workshop at Harvard, where we hosted a bunch of people from the conservation community, including our partners at WWF and elsewhere. So this is me as a second year presenting, like, okay, my next research project will be taking studies for historical patrol records and sparse and complete, and then doing patrols to gather more information. And then their response was, that's silly, we can't do that, because if we only went on areas where there's a lot of uncertainty, that means we'd be neglecting all these like known hotspots over here, and we just can't afford to do that. There's some places we just always have to go, so we can't only gather information. So I said, okay, scrap that, we're not doing active learning, but online learning to balance exploration and exploitation. That led to a paper at EAAAMO'23. It was literally, that was the kind of process of going through saying, okay, well, we have, the first project, which wasn't really that exciting for research perspective. It was just supervised learning with some, not very sophisticated ensembling behind the scenes. But then after, iterating, doing field tests there, and then moving on to the next stage, was I able to actually get at more meaty research questions, which was that online learning paper. And then I was trying to address the question that people would always ask, and we were always asking as well, which is, right now we're treating this as a stochastic model, where we're just kind of assuming that patterns from one year are going to be the same as the poaching patterns in the next year. But what if the poachers are strategic and are actually recognizing that, we're moving their snares and they start going elsewhere? And past work on trying to do control planning for these settings have treated these problems as backward security games, like what my advisor Helen had done with the Coast Guard. But a key challenge is that stack-of-work security games assume a perfectly rational adversary that has full observability of what the defender's actions are. So assuming that the poachers know exactly where the rangers are going, and that the poachers are all colluding together and planning an optimal strategy and response. But that's not a reasonable assumption in the setting, because the poachers are decentralized. It's a lot of individuals going out, not one centralized planner making those decisions. And they're also not able to view everything that we're doing. They have even less information than we do as rangers, and the rangers don't even know what the poachers are. So it's not reasonable to assume this, to have this backward assumption. So instead, I simplified the model and instead thought about a more kind of reactive adversary that's really focused on a local effect. So how do poachers who go to like one area, because oftentimes they have just from conversations with community members, we've learned that oftentimes poachers have like kind of favorite spots and they'll go again and again poaching in that area. So then now thinking like, okay, well, what if we have local responses? So in a more concentrated area, like a 1 square kilometer region, if we patrol more, maybe poaching will change later on. So then I looked at the data that we had in Uganda and said, okay, well, it seems like the poachers are reacting. They are being deterred, and then they'll be displaced. So they're kind of moving to neighboring regions. So then I built a RL model that's trying to account for uncertainty in those estimates. So that led to another paper that appeared at UAI. And then after going back and saying, okay, well, I built this like reinforcement learning model based off the assumption that poachers are responding to ranger patrols, and that's what it seems like the data suggests when I did this kind of when I did this logistic regression. But I was definitely not really satisfied with the model I had here, and I wanted to really, really understand how are the poachers actually responding. And shockingly, this question question of when ranges patrol more, does poaching, reduce? That question has never really been answered by the conservation community at all. There's been some correlational studies, but nothing that's been very conclusive. So that led me on a two-year journey, trying to bring causal inference to this picture of actually answering that question more satisfactorily for the first time. Where we also use machine learning to help improve our missing counterfactual data. So this was really, really trying to get at like the heart of these kind of policy questions that conservation folks are really passionate about as well. But each time bringing more and more AI methodology to as we better understand what the problems were and the problem setting. So I could have just jumped into this causal inference project, for example, because it really took those years of like domain integration and relationship building, and even to understand what was feasible and what were the right questions to ask and what the partners cared about. Okay, so because we're trying to follow this pipeline structure, so originally I was like talking about problem scoping and partnership building, and then solution design, and I'll talk about implementation and evaluation through field tests. And this is evaluating the supervised machine learning model. So it's a little bit non-chronological, but trying to keep with the structure of the pipeline. So after we had built machine learning predictions and poaching risk at the park, we wanted to make sure that they were reasonable and actually making a difference on the ground. So implemented a series of month-long field tests that I mentioned before, where we picked a random subset of areas that we thought were high risk of poaching, a random subset that we thought were medium risk of poaching, and a random subset that we thought were low risk of poaching, and kept it a blind experiment by not informing the rangers of the risk classifications in advance, and also making sure that we were only picking from areas that have been infrequently patrolled in recent months, so that we weren't just relying on historical patterns. And we have rangers patrol for a month at a time. So here's a few of rangers who, with all the snares and 3 chainsaws that they removed from 1 4-day patrol. And the results we got were that they have many more snares in the high risk regions than in the medium or low risk regions, which is really exciting to us. And this kind of self-contained experiment where we were comparing like for like was really valuable in this context where snaring is super stochastic and it also changes a lot month to month, year to year, and season to season. So even if we try to compare, how many snares are we finding this month compared to a month previously, that would be interesting and informative to us, but it wouldn't really be rigorous just because, maybe poaching like on the whole increased. So we found more snares this year and said, oh, we found more snares than last year. What if there's just twice as much poaching? So having a kind of more controlled experiment was the best we could do with this. And then after we had run those field tests, and we had repeated this in both Uganda and Cambodia, and I think that's one of the points that Emily was making, that doing those small scale pilots is really, really important to get things right before you move bigger. But after we did those and we were kind of happy with the results, and our partners were excited about scaling up, now we actually go to scale this work more globally by working with the SMART partnership, which is a consortium of 8 different conservation NGOs that's dedicated to protected area management. So SMART focuses on capacity building and training and implementation, and just having more data-driven and strategic patrol planning. And a big part of what they do is build and maintain a software system that is used to track and record ranger patrol observations. But before, it was just a database system that you could query, you could visualize, but there was no predictive or prescriptive component. And this is a huge gap that a lot of park managers really wanted. So we came in and built a plugin that integrates our machine learning model with their system using some cloud computing infrastructure. And what we are really hoping with this is really meeting parts where they are, using software that they're already familiar with, and taking the data in the format that they already have it in, so that we can make this kind of integration and scaling up as frictionless as possible. And as I mentioned, SMART is widely used by over 1,000 protected areas around the world, which will make our predictions and our model directly useful to them without any kind of additional work on their part. So really, in this process, leveraging existing economies of scale, avoiding introducing new friction points. So we're not asking them to like learn new software. We're not asking them to like, reformat their data for us. Really trying to meet them where they are, which also brings benefit to us. So we don't have to build a whole new software system for our own. And one thing that I think is really, really important about this is this enables us to add direct value to the partners that we've been working with for these many, many years. So we're not just kind of exploiting them for their data for the sake of our research, because my reinforcement learning paper provides no direct value to them. But hopefully the time and effort that I spent building up this system actually might. And this is, as we try to emphasize, a real iterative process. Here are photos from a site visit I did in Belize last year, and then this summer I was in Uganda, where I organized a 4-day workshop for rangers. So we had a group of 13 rangers in Rio Bravo Conservation Management area in Belize. And I kind of did this like 4-day workshop about like, what is AI? How can AI be used for patrol planning? And how can we analyzing the predictions and discussing with them how they might integrate these predictions into their patrol planning, but then also really trying to get feedback from them about what was surprising, what feels counterintuitive, and those become insights to us saying, okay, well, these are things that we might want to reevaluate in our model. And one thing that we learned, for example, is this was the first site that I worked with in Latin America. And apparently, there's actually not much snaring that happens in Latin America. There's just not much of a culture of snaring. So instead, most of the poaching is active poaching through gun hunting. And so that really kind of changed what we were doing. Before we were trying to predict snaring, but then in Belize, realizing that, okay, there's not much passive snaring happening. Instead, we started moving to predicting deforestation and illegal logging. So those are the kinds of conversations that really happened through those kind of like lunchside casual conversations that it's hard to fit into an hour-long Zoom meeting. There's maybe not that. Okay. So I'll just quickly close by emphasizing one point here. The work that is the research that is sophisticated from like a methodological perspective is not necessarily that is most impactful, and the work that is most impactful is not necessarily the most sophisticated. So that is really kind of emphasizing the methodological versus the impact cradle curve. And I think as Emily pointed out, it's really nice to try to like go further along that frontier, but sometimes it's our responsibility as researchers in this space to be kind of like going along both axes orthogonally, so we can kind of develop methodological work, but then make sure that it's a reciprocal relationship and provide some direct value in the meanwhile, even if it's not, a Saxony research project. Okay. Do you want to do questions? Yeah. Sorry, I just had a thought, but if there's any questions about that process before we move to Emily. Yeah. Are we okay?
It's kind of a bit of a separated, but for speaking, I just can you talk about how the pace of community-based work competes with the pressures of public and how to navigate the kind of trade-off there?
Yeah, the question is how to navigate the trade-off between doing community-based work, but then also facing the pressures to publish. And I don't have a perfect response, but basically I just got a lot of pressure all the time. So it's kind of the simultaneous pressure of the partner organization does not care about deadlines. They don't know, everything else that I'm going through, just in the same way that I don't know what else they're going through. So there's a point where, I scheduled a meeting with these folks in Belize and nobody showed up. And I said, hey, missed you. And I tried not to be too passive aggressive in my email. And I said, hey, sorry, we missed the meeting. There's been wildfires and we've been fighting fires the entire past week. And I'm like, okay, that's more important than like a Zoom meeting with me. So, I guess just recognizing the responsibility of like balancing my research load to make sure that I have like time and space to really be attentive to them and their needs so that I can be a reliable partner. Because otherwise it's just very easy for them to give up on me. And I think like showing up, making sure that I'm making like always respectful of their time. Anytime that, you know, they're giving me data or they're having a meeting with me, trying to say and emphasize like this is what I'm doing with this, and this is talking them through the process, and helping them see that I'm actually, you know, committed for the long run of providing something of value. But sometimes that really requires, you know, helping meeting their deadlines as well, and putting off research progress for 2 days because they asked me for some result or they asked me to help present at something. So sometimes I feel like those, like the way that something I explained to one of the more junior PhD students in my group who has been working on this project is that research collaborators, you know, are they're relatively plentiful, but real world partners are a dime a dozen. And even if we've been working with them for 3 years, if we're unreliable for a month, we might lose them completely. So just really, really recognizing how important those are. And in academia, there's like no real research emergency, you know, like nothing's actually that critical, but like there's more paper deadlines. But there, if these people stop fighting the wildfires in Belize, you know, we're going to lose all the trees and we can't recover that. So sometimes their emergencies are more important than mine.
Yes. No, okay, maybe it works. Thanks.
My question was just how do you navigate who's doing what in terms of the PhD student driving and the advisor? I'm sure it varies a lot, but any advice for, you know, should you be using that and planning yourself as a PhD student? Should you pick less initiative or do that?
Yeah, so the question was about kind of balancing that relationship between the PhD student and the advisor and who's doing what. And I'd say one of the benefits of being a PhD student, and I know there's also like masters and undergrads in this room, but benefit of being a PhD student is that it's a long program. So you know that, you know, if there's a project that you're excited about, like you will be around for like 4 or 5 years. And I think that really gives you allowance to be immersed and to take the time and to really build up those relationships, because you can do a lot and like learn a lot and contribute a lot in the course of your PhD. So I think that especially if you're early stage, it's really worthwhile to like be the person kind of pushing that and maintaining that for yourself. And of course, for advisors out there, like the thing to consider is you really have to kind of trust your student and also give them autonomy for those partnerships if that is something that you want to maintain, because it'd be really bad if that, you know, that student changes their mind or gets bored and then it kind of looks bad for your lab. So I think navigating that trade-off is something that advisors need to kind of curate, but my recommendation to junior researchers in particular is that it's worthwhile. Yeah. Okay. I will I'll give it to Emily, but thank you so much for the questions. And Emily's work is so when I get inspired every time I hear her talk about it. So
Thanks. We'll have a bit more time for questions as well at the end, before we jump into the activity. Maybe I'll just like comment very briefly on that last question as well. It's something that I found worked reasonably well in our group in this project that I'll talk about. It was kind of like my advisor, Josh Lewis at Berkeley, like formed the sort of high level partnerships with the government and the partners we're working with. And then I ended up forming a lot of sort of lower level friendship really and partnerships with like the lower level people in the government, and that's like what made the project work. Like was having like those text chains and those WhatsApp groups. But I felt like it was a nice sort of parallel thing. So if anything got really desperate, we sort of elevated up to the highest level, but among ourselves we could have the things. And I think it was again like really that like friendship and positivity in those relationships that made the project really well, relatively simply as I'll talk about. So I'll talk quickly about my own work in Togo, and like Lily, this is a project that I worked on for most of my PhD. It's on targeting humanitarian aid. Basically, we work with the government of Togo to design a cash transfer program that uses machine learning to select eligible beneficiaries. This was during the COVID pandemic. It ended up being published on the cover of Nature 2 years ago, and like got a ton of press coverage and looks really shiny from the outside, and was a great and crazy project to work on, but I'm really excited to kind of have the opportunity to lift back a little bit of the veil, like Lily was saying, and talk about like the partnerships and sort of all the work that went into making this project possible. So to start with kind of the, like Lily did, starting with sort of the origin story and how you can inform these partnerships. This is kind of a one-off project in this sense, because we had probably the easiest origin story, which is that the government of Togo, this Ministry of Digital Economy, which is one of the ministries of the government of Togo, this whole nation in West Africa, reached out to our research group and said, hey, we're starting this cash transfer program to help the poorest people in Togo during the pandemic. We don't know who to give transfers to. Can you help us develop algorithmic approaches to figuring out who is poorest and providing them cash transfers? And they had actually read, this was like second year of my PhD. In my first year, I'd written this paper that was at the time, I think, like a working paper, maybe it was on archive, that was on using machine learning and digital data sources to target humanitarian aid and social protection programs, basically showing, using some data from like years and years ago, that in simulation you could maybe use these approaches to target cash transfers. And they literally emailed us and were like, hey, we read your paper, we got connected by a fellow researcher, and we would love to have you work with us on this cash transfer program that we're developing for the pandemic. So again, I think this is like a pretty unusual origin story, like I mean, much more common. And since then, my life has been a lot more like what Lily described, of going out there and trying to talk to people and trying to sort of pitch these ideas and find partners. But in this case, the partnership basically fell into our lap. So we got really, really lucky. We also ended up forming like a three-way partnership. So originally it was the Ministry of Digital Economy in Togo, and ourselves to work on the cash transfer targeting algorithm. And we also brought in the NGO Give Directly, and they've been interested in exploring these types of approaches for a while. They had a bunch of funding to provide cash transfers using machine learning targeting approaches, and also a ton of expertise in delivery of cash. So it became this like three-way partnership between ourselves, Give Directly, and the government that ended up rolling out this program called Nodisi, which is an entirely digital cash transfer program. So to register for the program, people dialed like a short code on their mobile phone. They filled out a short SMS-based survey to register, and then if they were eligible, they received the benefits via mobile banking. But again, the big challenge and the part where we were sort of helping with the project is this question of how to target beneficiaries. And so the government really built this entire cash transfer delivery platform, and Give Directly provided all the funding, and then it was on us to figure out how to do the algorithmic portion. And so in terms of, again, thinking, like Lily was talking about how we sort of went about designing the solution, I started out by talking with the government and Give Directly sort of 1 to 2 times a week. Again, it was like all pretty rushed. It was the pandemic. This was 2020 April, I suppose, that the project got started. And so we were all like working from home, and me and my advisor were waking up at like 6 or 7 a.m. every morning to get on the phone with the partners from either the government or Give Directly, or both. And then in September 2020, the airport in Lomé, Togo opened, and the people from Give Directly said, okay, we're gonna just go there and try to make this project happen. Who from your group is coming? And I was like, well, I guess that's gonna be me. So I ended up flying to Togo, and I ended up spending about 6 months there during the pandemic, basically until this program got rolled out. So again, kind of to Lily's point, it was like very, the partnership took a lot of time. Like I think about the time I invested in this project, certainly there was parts of doing actual machine learning. I was writing code some of the time, but a lot more of the time I was like working with partners, talking to partners, doing random things to help the partners be more effective. And really just like, we were all working towards this like united goal of rolling out this cash transfer program, and that was very, very powerful, but it was also at the time like, really consuming, and I basically didn't work on anything else for about a year. In terms of what we actually looked at, so we started by looking into different targeting approaches using machine learning. We looked at sort of standard targeting approaches that would not rely on any machine learning, kind of like baseline approaches that the government could have implemented at the time. So things like geographic targeting, just like paying everybody living in the poorest parts of the country, or occupation-based targeting, paying everybody in certain occupations as possible, because the government had recently done a large voter registration drive where they had somewhat at random selected occupations for everybody. And then we looked at what sort of our group's, I guess, comparative advantage was, what we've been researching for a while, with AI-informed approaches based on satellite imagery and mobile phone data. So can we like target everybody in a really like in a neighborhood using really high resolution estimates of poverty from satellite imagery, or can we target individuals based on poverty estimated from mobile phone use based on mobile phone metadata provided by those two mobile network operators? We'll talk about that in a second. And then lastly, we compared to like survey-based approaches the government couldn't really implement at the time. Like ideally, they would go household to household and collect data on poverty, but they didn't have any such data existing, and during the pandemic, they couldn't go out and collect such data. We nonetheless looked at trying to simulate how accurate those approaches would be if in the future the government could collect data. All of this was like well before we developed the program. We were working with like a survey that was conducted in Togo in 2018 to get a sense of actual ground truth poverty. And then simulating all these approaches and basically interacting games with the government, presenting results on the accuracy of these various approaches and getting their sense of which one they would want to roll out and actually implement. Super briefly on how these actually work. I don't want to spend a lot of time on like the research in this talk because that's not really what we're here for. In terms of predicting poverty from satellite imagery, the idea here is satellite images contain a lot of information about which areas are wealthy and which areas are poor. You can think about like roof material, access to water, forest cover, density of housing, road quality, and so on. Use some deep learning regression methods, turn those into predictions of poverty at satellite time level, and then we aggregated those together to get sort of an estimate of poverty at the canton out of 4 level in Togo. You can think of those as like counties in Togo, counties in the US, roughly a Togo in size. We also looked into a component of phone-based targeting. So for phone-based targeting, the intuition here is again, the way people use their phones is like really predictive of how poor or wealthy they are. You might think that like people who are wealthier are likely to just make more calls, make more international calls, use more mobile data rather than just using like calls and SMS because they might have access to a smartphone. The challenge, of course, is well, I guess the first challenge is getting access to data. So maybe I'll talk about data access very briefly. We worked with Togo's 2 mobile network operators to get access to all of the mobile phone metadata that they reported in the sort of course of their day-to-day operations, with information about like this phone number calls this other phone number at this time, lasted for this duration, and went through this cell tower, which gives you a sort of vague sense of location. From these data, we calculated roughly 1,500 statistics describing how each subscriber in Togo uses their mobile phone. And then we conducted a large survey of 10,000 people in Togo, which we used to train a machine learning on to predict poverty from these various phone features, and then predicted poverty for everybody in Togo as a potential appropriate approach. Again, we're still in like the pre-deployment phase. We spent a lot of time trying to understand how accurate these various targeting approaches were. So to the extent that you're trying to reach some of the poorest people based on a metric like consumption expenditure, your targeting approach is looking at phone-based targeting is likely to correctly identify some group of people as being the poorest. There's also going to be errors of inclusion and errors of exclusion that I'm showing in red, and then of course a set of people who are correctly excluded. And so the question is, how accurately does this approach using phone data or any of the other approaches we simulated work for targeting the poorest in comparison to the various other feasible alternatives? So even before we wrote the program, we showed our partners this graph, which was based on this data collected in 2018, pre-pandemic, that compared the accuracy of targeting using phone data and satellite imagery to other approaches the government could have taken. So for example, the geographic targeting approaches were actually feasible, but the phone-based approach was more accurate, whereas approaches that require going household to household and collecting ground truth data on poverty are, of course, more accurate, but infeasible to implement during the pandemic. So based on all of this analysis that we showed them, we finally got around to actually rolling out the program, and we worked with the government to roll out the satellite-based approach to selecting geographies and the phone-based approach to selecting individuals for eligibility. Like I said, we had to conduct a survey to collect training data. The survey was conducted over the phone. We surveyed about 10,000 people. Actually, enumerating a survey is a lot of work. I don't know if anybody here has enumerated surveys. Managing and enumerating surveys is like a huge amount of labor and not something I expected to do going into my PhD. And that's I think like sort of another piece of like hidden labor in these AI for social good projects is this kind of data collection activity. Satellite data was comparatively easy. We were working with data that we already had access to. But then mobile phone data is of course very challenging, it's privately held, it's typically difficult to access. And so we work with the mobile phone operators at some length to sign these data sharing agreements and to work with them to eventually actually share this anonymized version of the data set. We went back and forth. This was months and months of work went into working with the mobile network operators to actually access the type of data that we needed and make sure that data was high quality, that there weren't any sort of issues with it. Again, a huge amount of work. It's not just like exactly machine learning, was just going into these data exchanges. And then lastly, I think something that came up a lot in this project is that sort of our targeting algorithm was embedded in this broader socio-technical system, this delivery of cash transfer system that the government and people directly rolled out. I was less involved in developing that system, but there were a lot of issues that came up in just embedding the algorithm into this broader digital delivery system. And I think that's again sort of another meta lesson I've learned from this project with others, is that while the algorithmic component can be important, all of these other technical components surrounding it are also going to have a lot of effect on how successful your systems. Moving to the last component of the pipeline in terms of evaluation, I already showed you some evaluations of targeting accuracy, but after the program was rolled out, we did another survey to evaluate how accurately the algorithm was able to target the forest in our actual deployment. And we found that actually the setting of phone-based targeting approach was more accurate than not only geographic targeting, but also targeting on like data collected in the survey, like in SFPMs. I talked at the beginning about the importance of doing impact evaluations and understanding whether AI-informed interventions are actually having positive impacts on people. So we also, since then, as part of the rollout of the NoVC program, the cash transfer program, we did an RCT. So we had limited funding in the first phase. People were randomized into the first phase of the program's rollout. And then a second phase where the remaining people were given their cash transfers, and in between we conducted a survey to get an estimate of the program's impact, and we found positive effects on things like food security, mental health, and aggregate index of welfare. But just to give you a sense of the timelines in this type of project, this paper has only just come out now, even though we actually implemented it about 3 years. And then lastly, something I'm really excited about these days, and again to my point in the earlier part about the importance of looking at like algorithmic externalities and how the systems are really affecting people on the ground. It's been really cool to get to do a project in partnership with another PhD student at Berkeley, her name is Zoe Khan, on trying to understand the perspectives of people who were impacted by this algorithm that was used to allocate cash transfers in Togo. So we've gone back since then and done a bunch more field work in the rural communities where this algorithm was used, and done qualitative interviews with people who applied for the program and either did or didn't receive benefits along with community leaders, and just trying to sort of understand what their experiences were with the cash transfer program, with the algorithm. This was like hugely informative, and it's completely changed the way I would think about implementing these types of projects again in the future. And so I really can't recommend enough doing these kinds of qualitative evaluations. We tried to understand things about privacy, like what privacy norms and expectations were of people in rural Togo, especially about the use of mobile phone metadata, which is private and potentially sensitive. Issues of explanation and how people understood algorithmic eligibility criteria and how those criteria could be effectively explained to low education and low literacy communities. And then also questions around social cohesion and like again, these sort of algorithmic externalities, what were the potential negative effects of the algorithmic approach to targeting cash transfers on things like social cohesion and social ties. Finally, just to comment briefly on maintenance and replication. So you've heard from Lily sort of one example of how what maintenance can look like in these types of systems and sort of larger deployment can look like. In our case, we've since the work in Togo, we're currently replicating similar targeting approaches in programs in Bangladesh and Haiti. And we give directly to this NGO that sort of specializes in cash transfers who become super interested in these approaches. And so that's made it somewhat easier to try to hand off the targeting systems, sort of one NGO that's particularly invested in them. I also took like a summer off of my PhD research to take all the code in the Togo project and turn it into, calling it a software package is probably a slight overstatement. It's like research code maybe masquerading as a software package, but trying to at least make the code reusable for other researchers, and perhaps also for data scientists working in industry or in government. But as I think I'm more and more involved in these like real world projects, really working with governments, working with NGOs to make these cash transfer programs happen. It raised a lot of really interesting questions for me, so I thought maybe I should pose some of them for you all to consider for discussion. around things like what's the role of researchers when we act sort of as data scientists and as sort of quasi-consultants for governments and NGOs and these types of projects. Also, how to balance the incentives of different stakeholders. So like in this work in Togo, we had an NGO, we had ourselves, research team, we had government policymakers, and then we had like large institutional funders, like the World Bank was really essential in funding a lot of the data collection for the surveys. And balancing these, everybody had different incentives, and balancing those is like a huge challenge and continues to be a challenge in making these types of projects for last thing, just as I was putting together these slides, it reminded me of what an incredible team it took to make this project and this cash transfer program in Togo happen. I think there are probably at least 100, if not more, people involved in this project, and like I get to be the one to talk about it, but there are so many people from the government who give directly, from the mobile network operators. We had 100+ survey enumerators that worked for us out of our survey from Togo. And since then, our interview facilitators and translators for the qualitative research have all put so much time and effort into this project. And so just generally thinking about how I think these AI for social good projects, especially at scale, require much, much larger teams and much more diverse teams in terms of fields and in terms of what they specialize in than sort of your standard AI project. And this is like amazing. I had the best time getting to work with these people, but it also definitely raises its own kind of challenges. All right, so just to close up a few sort of like really I wanted to kind of a few reflecting thoughts. Again, partners critical. There's a lot of partners and balancing a lot of incentives. Iteration is super important. So in this project and like in Lily's project, we met with partners again and again as we were rolling out the project, and that was really essential to building trust and to putting together a worthwhile solution in the end. Finally, I just wanted to make this comment. I think that everything I've talked about is when we both talk about like implementation and partnerships and how to make these projects really happen. But I do think these types of projects can lead to really interesting technical challenges. Like I think Lily's work really highlights that. In my own work, we've become increasingly interested in sort of active learning and methods of data collection because we collect our own training data. And so I do think having these constraints and having these motivations of impact do lead us sometimes to really interesting technical challenges. My last final point I've sort of become more and more passionate about as I do this work is that, I think a lot of the time, or sometimes we like to think to ourselves, oh, we're doing AI for social impact, so we're automatically doing work that is good, and we're sort of off the hook. But in fact, I think issues with things like fairness, privacy, explainability, and again, what I'm calling like algorithmic externalities are just as important here in the typical AI project, if not even more important when we're looking at these high-stakes contexts in the vulnerable.